Thank you, and it's a real honour to be with you today and to share my thoughts and memories of Will. Will and I met in 2011 during that toxic carbon tax debate. And I remember him coming into the Department of Climate Change wearing an outfit pretty similar to this, a blue shirt, a grey jacket. He had his black backpack slung over his shoulder. He was a regular at the department, and I just started working there a couple of weeks before, and he'd written a report which was going to be the first report of the Climate Commission, and it was a substantive look at climate science in Australia and a rallying call to action. And I approached the meeting by sitting down with him and somewhat boldly telling him we needed to totally and fundamentally change the report, reorder it and change the language. I don't quite know how I had the audacity to do that, but particularly he's a world expert in the field, he's an excellent communicator, he was 30 years my senior. But Will just listened to me and said, right, that sounds like a great idea, let's get started. And for me, that was the start of just such a wonderful collaboration in how we were working to change the language of climate change and extreme weather in this country. And every time Will would tell the story of our first meeting, he would recount finding the phrase, the critical decade, at page 73, and that I found it and I elevated it to the title of the report. He actually did that, but he'd always attribute it to me in the way that he would so often attribute others their contributions, and he would always be recognising them and building up those around him. It was a great thing as a young person to work with someone who was such a champion of my ideas and my work. I was very lucky that Will recognised the value that I could bring and backed me every step of the way from that very first meeting. And it was in that year at the Commission when we started working together on a theory of change that we pursued later in earnest at the Climate Council. The reason I'd started the job was that I wanted to change the communications environment in Australia. I thought that people needed to be much more aware of the urgency of the challenge and that we needed to talk through the solutions with people. At that time, the public climate science communication was basically the same as the communication within the literature. It was full of jargon and caveats and detail. It couldn't cut through to the general audience. It was so wonderful working with Will, who was such an enthusiastic collaborator with communicators, to develop a language that was clear, it was accurate, it was powerful. We'd work together going back and forth. Can we say it like this? Can we do it like that? Is that going to be accurate if we say it this way? We came up with language that was simple but never simplistic. Heat waves are hotter, longer, they're happening more often. Sounds like just such a basic phrase, but it took weeks to come up with that sort of language. Climate on steroids, the angry summer, the critical decade were all phrases that we worked on. A couple of years after Will and I had met, the Climate Commission was abolished by the Abbott government. And you may recall 4 days later, Will, Tim Flannery, Leslie Hughes, Jerry Houston and I created the Climate Council with a big public launch that was at the time Australia's biggest ever crowdfunding campaign. And I remember when we started seeing the donations coming in, Will punching the air and saying, wow, we can do it. And we immediately decided we needed to publish reports as quickly as possible. Will had a really busy schedule of travel going back and forth to Europe, but he wrote the reports on the plane, and basically every time he touched down, we'd get him in front of the media to launch a new report to show that we were back in business. Although we really weren't back in business, we were just building the plane as we were sort of taking off. But over the next few months, Leslie Hughes, Will and Martin Rice put together a whole range of reports which really established us as an institution that could be trusted and reliable and would have that information. Changing the public conversation, particularly a toxic one, requires relentless communication. Will was an author to about 70 publications during the 9 years he was involved in the council. He would have done thousands of media interviews, and I imagine it would have been mind-numbingly repetitive for him, although he never complained, at times to say the same thing over and over again that he of course had been saying for many more years prior to that. We published The Angry Summer, Abnormal Autumn, Weird Weather, Weird Winter, Off the Charts, report after report saying the same thing on heat, on drought and fire, on sea level rise. It's Climate Council mythology that Will got off a plane from Stockholm and went straight to a press conference and then did 80 interviews back to back through the rest of the day here and overseas. He used his profile to build the profile of others. Journalists would come to the press conference for him, but we'd bring along a doctor or a vet or a farmer to build their profile as well. He'd do stunts, we'd have him in front of on boats looking at sea level rise. We'd be standing in front of fire trucks, defence ships, solar panels. He would do whatever it took to get more coverage. His gravitas, his knowledge, his capacity to communicate, to stick to the message, his commitment to our theory of change, which takes many years, were critical ingredients. And over the last 10 years, I don't think there's anyone in Australia who's done more to change the story on climate change than Will, and no one else that couldn't have done it without his knowledge and gravitas and willingness to take a risk at that time, which was an incredibly toxic environment. It's a highlight of my life to have been able to craft that language together, and that's gradually permeated the lexicon in Australia. And you see it around the world now, a lot of the language that we created. The early years of the council, like the commission, required toughness and courage, and Will was often in the firing line of a lot of attacks. The Daily Telegraph had a crusade against us. They trawled through hours and hours of footage on our website because we did lots of forums. They trawled through every inch of our reports. They never found an error that Will had made in all of their looking, and they looked, I can tell you they looked. Between 2013 and 2017, there were death threats, there were front page attack stories, endless Andrew Bolt ravings and criticism from politicians, but nothing would deter Will from telling the truth. He was brave and he was never scared of telling the truth, no matter what the truth was. He could be fierce in defending the science. I remember when the government had, the Abbott government censored a UNESCO report and we got wind of it. He was livid, so we went public with it, and Will called Minister Hunt a Stalinist, which you can imagine Mr. Hunt didn't enjoy being called a Stalinist, and he had a major meltdown, but Will just didn't answer his calls. So, too bad, Mr. Hunt. In 2019, Will raised with us that the science was landing on the fact that 1.5 degrees temperature rise was unavoidable. My heart sunk, the ink's barely dry on the Paris Agreement. How can we tell people the critical threshold's been reached? Will people give up? But Will was absolute. We have to tell the public as soon as possible and use it as a galvanising moment. He then did the work to quantify what it takes to get our emissions down to the levels that would be required, 75% reduction this decade. And that's been a really important piece in shifting the landscape from this 2050 is the deadline to actually the effort has to happen this decade. And when it came to the science, to the truth, Will was its unrelenting, fierce champion. When I reflect on my time in social change, what stands out is the most important thing is persistence, and Will had that in spades. But he was never doom and gloom. He was the original stubborn optimist, to use Christina Figueroa's phrase. He was always infusing his communications with tangible hope. Being a human being requires us to hold multiple realities in our minds. We're mortal, those we love are mortal, but it's hard to believe that until it actually happens. The climate crisis requires us to hold multiple realities too. The crisis is all around us, but we look out the window and it's a beautiful day. The solutions are hard to imagine in terms of the speed and scale, but we have to convince people of them. Will steadfastly believed that we could tackle the climate crisis, we could create a better world. And he put his money where his mouth was. He was directly involved in activities to make solutions a reality. He was very proud of the work he did here in the ACT, serving on the Climate Change Council to transform his beloved Canberra, not just for Canberra, but also as an example to the rest of the world. He encouraged the Climate Council to do more work on solutions, and he was very passionate about supporting First Nations campaigners in taking on fossil fuel projects, as Penny will speak about. His determined hope was often balm for me when I felt like giving up, when I thought it's too hard, the problem's too big, I'm really scared. I'd call Will and he would reassure me, he would have the answers when I wouldn't have them. Will, I'll be forever grateful that I had the opportunity to work with you so closely for so long. To see up close the leader of such integrity, who persisted against the odds, championed other people, particularly women, who was always listening and always learning. A leader who was so generous and kind and deeply committed to his family. Sonia and Carrie, who would always be telling us on trips about your adventures, and he had such pride and affection in telling those stories. Will, you've had a profound impact on the world, and I'll miss you so much, and I still can't believe that you're gone. And we'll have you with us as we try and create this new world that you've inspired us to want. And to follow on from Brian's analogy, this beautiful symphony that you've been creating The music continues. The music is the inspiration that's in all of us and people all around the world. It's in your science and it's in the words that are being spoken about this issue that will be spoken for so long to come. Thank you.